Viking invasions. What raiders saw beneath the forest. The Viking age and era defined by fire and steel. Their longships, dragon prows tasting the salt spray, were vessels of terror and ambition. They were masters of the lightning raid, striking without warning at the soft, unprotected coasts of Europe. Monasteries and towns knew their fury, but the world of the Norsemen was far bigger than the shorelines they ravaged. They believed in a reality layered with unseen dangers, a place where gods walked among giants and monsters. They understood that deep in the earth and dark in the woods, there were forces far older, forces far more terrible than any earthly king. For most, these were just stories for the long winter nights, warnings to keep the kids from wandering too far from the lone house. But what if a war party came face to face with those fears? What if their greatest enemy wasn't the wrath of men, but the wrath of the woods themselves? This is a story whispered in hushed tones. A tale inspired by the fever dreams of a broken survivor, about what he saw waiting beneath the forest. Our story starts in the aftermath of a brutally successful raid. Jarl Sigurd, a man whose one good eye had seen more slaughter than a dozen lesser men, led his band of 40 warriors. They were flush with victory, their longship heavy with silver and gold, torn from a smoldering monastery. But they'd lingered too long. The local lord's army was closing in, and Sigurd made a fateful choice. Instead of risking the open coast, he ordered his men to drag their ship upriver, deep into the vast, suffocating forest. They'd cut across the land and outrun any real resistance. It was a classic Viking strategy, using rivers to penetrate deep inland. Before vanishing, it was a sound plan. But the forest they were about to enter wasn't on any map they knew. For the first day, the Vikings were loud. These were strong men, their arms thick with muscle from the oar and the axe, and their spirits were high. They laughed and boasted about the riches waiting for them back home. The forest, however, didn't share their good mood. It was an ancient place, a tangled mess of colossal oaks and yews that clawed at the sky. Their canopy was so thick it swallowed the sun, plunging the forest floor into a constant twilight. The air grew still and heavy, smelling of damp earth and rot. First, the men's laughter died. Then their talk dwindled to just the necessary commands. The only sounds were the creak of leather straps as they hauled their ship, the snap of twigs under their boots, and their own ragged breathing. There were no birds, no animals scurrying in the undergrowth. The silence was absolute, a living thing that pressed in on them from all sides. Einar, a young warrior on his first raid, felt it most. He had sharp eyes, and as he scanned the oppressive walls of trees, he saw things the others missed. The gnarled roots of the oaks looked less like wood and more like knotted veins. He saw symbols carved into the bark. Not the clean runes of his people, not the crosses of the Christians, but spiraling, chaotic patterns that seemed to writhe at the edge of his vision. He mentioned it to Rolf, a hulking berserker whose bare chest was a roadmap of scars. Rolf, always eager for a sign from the gods, just grunted. He was a follower of the old ways, a man who sought Odin's favor. Berserkers were famous for entering trance-like furies, believing they channeled the spirits of bears or wolves. To him, these strange woods were just another test. "This land is sick," he growled. "The sooner we're quit of it, the better." But leaving wasn't so simple anymore. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, Sigurd called a halt. They made camp in a small clearing. As the men chewed on dried fish, a low guttural rumble echoed from deep in the earth beneath their feet. It sounded like 1,000 grinding stones, and it seemed to vibrate right up through the soles of their boots. The men exchanged uneasy glances. An earthquake? Or just old roots settling? They stoked their fires higher, the flames pushing back the immense, watching darkness. That night, nobody slept well. The next morning, things got weirder. Olin, a scout sent to find a clear path, didn't come back. Sigurd, impatient and grim, sent 2 more men to find him. They returned an hour later, their faces pale. They'd found Olin's tracks, and then, they said, the tracks just stopped. No signs of a struggle. No drag marks. Just the deep impressions of Olin's boots in the soft earth. And then nothing. It was as if he'd been plucked straight up into the sky. Panic, cold and sharp, began to eat at the war party's discipline. These were men who feared no mortal foe, but this was different. This was unnatural. That's when Einar noticed it. A few yards from where the tracks ended, a thick, pale root, nearly as thick as a man's arm, lay exposed on the forest floor. It was coated in something dark and wet. A root, he swore, hadn't been there the day before. "We're being hunted," Einar whispered, his voice tight with a dread he'd never known on any battlefield. Sigurd silenced him with a glare, but his one good eye darted nervously into the gloom. He ordered the men to form up, to move faster, placing his most seasoned warriors at the front and back. But how do you guard against an enemy you can't see? An enemy that leaves no tracks and makes no sound? The psychological toll started to mount. The Vikings often used their terrifying reputation as a weapon. But here, in the suffocating silence, a terror was turned back on them. They started hearing things. A whisper that sounded like the wind, but with the cadence of a dead man's chant. A snap, like a massive bone breaking, from a place where no tree was large enough to make it. Rolf the Berserker began muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused, gnawing at the edge of his shield. A common ritual, to psych up for battle. But here, it looked less like preparation, and more like the start of madness. That afternoon, the forest claimed another. From the rear of the column came a single muffled cry, instantly choked off. The man behind Einar, a veteran named Kolf, was just gone. His shield lay on the ground, the wood splintered and shattered, not by an axe, but as if squeezed by an impossible, crushing force. The Vikings, now truly terrified, drew together. Sigurd bellowed the command they all knew. Skjaldborg, shield wall. In a motion born of 100 battles, the warriors formed the iconic shield wall. Round shields locked together, creating a bristling fortress of wood and steel. Spears poked out from between the gaps. It was a formation made to repel any charge or infantry assault. It was not made for this. They stood in their defensive circle, shoulder to shoulder, peering into the silent, hateful woods. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, becoming more terrifying than any war cry. And then, the ground began to move. It wasn't a tremor this time. The soil itself seemed to ripple, to writhe. All around their shield wall, the earth churned like water. From the ground erupted creatures of nightmare. They weren't beasts of flesh and blood, but horrors of root and shadow, things born of the ancient soil itself. Huge, segmented bodies like immense, pale worms twisted into the air. They had no eyes, but their fronts split open into terrifying maws, lined with rings of teeth made from sharpened root and stone. And from these maws came a sound that froze the blood, a distorted, horrifying mimicry of the human scream. Svinfylking. To me, Sigurd roared, his voice cracking with terror and rage. Wedge formation. We break through. It was their only chance. The shield wall was a static defense, and they were being picked apart. The boar's snout was a desperate, aggressive charge, designed to punch through an enemy line. The remaining Vikings rallied to their Jarl, forming a tight spearhead of fury and desperation. Rolf the Berserker was at the very tip, his face a mask of insane glee, finally face to face with a foe he could kill. He howled like a wolf. As a true Berserker gang took hold, they charged. Their charge was a blur of desperate courage. They smashed into the root creatures, axes and swords hacking at the pale, wood-like flesh. The things bled a thick, black sap that steamed where it touched armor. They were fighting the forest itself. For every creature they cut down, 2 more seemed to rise from the ground. A warrior was impaled by a spear-like root that shot up from the earth, lifting him into the air. Another was simply pulled down into the churning soil, his desperate hands the last to disappear. Sigurd, their one-eyed Jarl, went down fighting. A massive creature coiled around his legs, and despite planting his axe deep into its body, he was dragged down. His last words were a defiant roar, a curse, aimed not at the creatures, but at the stolen Christian gold that led them here. Soon, only Einar was left. Scrabbling, weeping, his mind shattered, he ran. He ran without thought, without direction, fueled only by primal terror. Behind him, the forest echoed with the screams of his shield brothers, and the horrifying, mocking cries of the root things. He burst from the tree line and didn't stop until the dark woods were just a hateful line on the horizon. Einar was the only one who made it out. He was found weeks later wandering the coast, a man whose youth had been scoured away, leaving only a hollow-eyed shell. He told his tale, a rambling, incoherent story of a forest that was alive and hated men, of creatures made of root and earth that dragged warriors into the ground. Most who heard it dismissed it as the ravings of a mind broken by battle and guilt. But the old skalds, the keepers of lore, they listened. They knew the world was filled with dark places and ancient things. They knew of the Landbetter, the guardian spirits of the land, who could be vengeful if shown disrespect. They knew of trolls and giants that lurked in the wilderness. Einar's story, as mad as it sounded, rang with a terrible truth they understood, that for all their strength and fury, men were merely guests in a world far older and stranger than they could ever comprehend. His tale would have become a whispered warning, a reminder that some treasures are best left in the earth, and some forests are best left undisturbed, because you never know what horrors might be waiting just beneath the surface. The fears of the ancient world were often rooted in the real darkness that lay just beyond the campfire. If you love exploring these tales from the edge of history and myth, make sure to subscribe and join the conversation. What forgotten horrors do you think are still lurking in the world's untamed corners? Let us know in the comments below. Countless thanks for subscribing, liking, and commenting on our video. God bless us all always.